Hi, I'm Lin Walker, immigration partner at Minor and Landis, and I am joined today by one of my all-time favorite people. No joke. I have known this person for over 13 years, and we actually met during a period in my life when I was taking a break from being an attorney. So, my guest today is the absolutely wonderful Timothy Lewis. So, I met Tim in June 2010 when we were both teacher training with the New York City Teaching Fellows. And although we were placed at different schools, we both completed many of our graduate courses in science and education together. Even then, Tim was a completely grounded, compassionate, and unflappable person who never seemed to be weighed down by the stresses of teaching and nurturing students and adults while we were both teachers in New York City public schools. Although I left teaching in 2016 and returned full-time to the legal practice, Tim left in 2021 and, not surprisingly to anyone who knows him, became a mindfulness coach and embodied movement director. And we'll dig into what those are a little deeper in a moment. Tim is a Jay Shetty certified mindfulness coach and educator at heart with over 15 years of dynamic experience, honoring unique individuality and nurturing innate curiosity. As an avid researcher of epigenetics, human psychology, and the new human biology, he allows a love of learning and growth to fuel his zest for life. Timothy is a 200-hour RYT with training in the foundations of yin and trauma-sensitive yoga. Timothy teaches an everyday mindfulness and meditation course and works with individuals and groups looking to explore how mindfulness can neutralize the effects of stress and modern living, and offers embodied movement classes, including yoga and capoeira. Timothy enjoys training and teaching, travel, and exploring the contrast of being deeply drawn to nature while embracing the hustle and bustle of New York City. So thank you for joining us today, Tim.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. And thank you for that introduction. As you were talking about our time together in teacher training, I was always intrigued by learning about people who were choosing to come into the teaching profession with so many different skill sets and different backgrounds. So I appreciate that you were sharing that.
So let's get to the first question. Um, can you tell us what it means to be a mindfulness coach and an embodied movement director?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I think about the word mindfulness, right, I have many reflections of what that means. And one of the first things that come up for me is sort of the connotation that mindfulness looks a certain way, right? That it takes a particular form, or sometimes that means sitting in a particular position, or perhaps it even means the quality of the thought that happens. And so one of the first things that come up for me is really reframing that word mindfulness, and it's with great appreciation and gratitude with those who have put so much work into it. But for me, mindfulness is really about attitudes of mind, and really more about who we are being in our everyday life versus what it is that we're doing. Life is always happening, and it's really the nature of the mind to be engaged and to be creative, to be innovative. And so when I think about mindfulness, I think more so about attitudes of mind and ways of being. And
Mm-hmm.
so as it pertains to the embodied movement piece, here we are in these incredible human bodies, and that allows us to move through this experience. And oftentimes, I know in my experience, I existed for a long time without a true felt connection to what it meant to be in my body. And so I'm very fortunate to have a background in sports and dance. And so I've always moved my body, but to really understand what it means to be in this body is, what I think about when I hear embodied movement. And so essentially the opportunity to understand how our thoughts, our emotions, and how even environments impact our physical being.
That's wonderful. And that is a very different perspective of mindfulness, which seems to be a very, loaded term today. Depending on who you speak to, it seems to mean different things, and depending on what books you read, there sometimes appears to be a rigidity in how how you attain mindfulness. Like again, what you were kind of mentioning, specific positions where you have to sit or lay or stand, and so it's nice that you have embraced a more fluid definition of what mindfulness can be, a more open definition. So I guess my next question for you is, how did you get into this? I guess, is it a huge jump from teaching to, science to teaching mindfulness and embodied movement?
That's a really interesting question. I think it could be a big jump, but the way I describe it, I always say the word mindfulness sort of caught up with who I already am. I have always been a naturally curious person. I've allowed sort of this chasing my curiosity to lead me into most of the places that I've been, most of the experiences, So for me, becoming a mindfulness coach felt like a natural transition,
Mhm.
especially with the integration of the science piece. In terms of formal practice, I remember journaling as a young boy. For me, that was a major outlet, just to have a place to be able to put my thoughts on paper. And so, as a formal practice, I had no idea what journaling even was. In fact, at that time, I think it was more so called like a diary. And, there were like these limitations to who is it that keeps a diary. It was mostly
Mhm.
females, right? And so that was like my little outlet. Um, I started my formal training with mindfulness teachers in 2016, where I was first exposed to John Kabat-Zinn, who is accredited with much of the sort of foundational research as we know it here in the West. And I remember seeing one of his posters on the New York City subway. And again, it was the curiosity, this like, I wonder what
Mhm.
that's about. It sounded very interesting. And I literally went to a lecture with John Kabat-Zinn at the Lincoln Center all by myself, just because it felt right. And so for me, my journey in mindfulness and exposure to it has really grown exponentially by virtue of really following that curiosity.
I think I want to return to the initial question that you were talking, where I was asking you about, like, what exactly is mindfulness and embodied movement. Can you give us an example of, at its core, what these two things are, how they work together, and can a coach help? Because I don't really know what you mean by these two things. Like, I've heard other people talk about them, and they seem to be very different from what you're explaining.
hmm So when I explain what it means to be mindful, the formal definition can be really helpful, right? It's being present without judgment. Very simple.
Hmm.
Now, the it gets complex because within the practice of mindfulness are many tools that can be used, right? So here's a great analogy that I like to think about when I think about, for example, exercise, right? Underneath that umbrella of exercise, there are many ways to engage with exercise.
Hmm.
And so it is with mindfulness, right? So there are many tools that we can use to be present and also not judge. So when we think about presence, for example, oftentimes our physical presence, where we are in any given moment, might be drastically different than the thoughts we're having. Our thoughts sometimes are ruminations of the past or
Hmm.
fretting about a future, as opposed to being truly present. And so, for example, that presence might mean I am sitting in a chair, my feet are making contact with the earth, right? This is kind of a very tangible example of what it means to be mindful. So, when we think about mindfulness and we think about the attitudes of mindfulness, we can almost think of them as different pillars, right? So, there's the pillar of curiosity, there's the pillar of having a beginner's mind, there's the pillar of non-attachment. So these are three big ones, right? And generally, there are more, but we'll kind of start from that place. So how is it that I can be present? And that also means with experiences that may be pleasant, with experiences that are not necessarily pleasant, and at the same time, practice not judging those as good or bad. And so, relative to mindfulness, when I think about embodied, I'll give a personal example for when I first started my physical yoga practice. And I remember being in one of my first classes, and, as we as yoga teachers often do, we give cues for people to really engage with the practice. And I remember standing in, Warrior Two, and the teacher says, "Roll your hip under," and I stood there for quite a while, pretty perplexed because I couldn't physically feel my hip in any particular position. And so when we think about embodying these physical bodies, it's literally being able to become aware of what it feels like. Because oftentimes one piece that is missing is sort of the way that our physiology informs our mind, and our
Mhm.
mind informs our physiology. And so this connection is not separate, but actually intricately combined.
I love that. I love that story and that example because what I thought was so lovely about yoga and why I thought it was so helpful as a practice is um, I think it's very easy in this society to become self absorbed, to go through life not knowing where you fit within an environment or how you can impact the environment around you. There's like, for some people, a complete lack of body awareness. And I remember when I first started taking yoga, and the instructor would say to close your eyes and do something. And it was very simple. It was close your eyes and sit on the ground on your sit bones with a straight back. And I was like, that's incredibly challenging because number one, how do you know your back is straight with your eyes closed? You don't have a mirror. How do you know whether you're leaning front or back? And those are like core muscles that, as we work more and more in offices, become weaker and weaker. And I just remember the sensation of finally being able to sit and know where I was in the room and in relation to the people next to me without having to see them. I could feel them, and I could feel whether my back was straight or I was hunched over, whether my shoulders were up near my ears, which tends to happen towards the end of the day and we get stressed. So I love that story about yoga and like rolling your hip under, because sometimes, especially in beginners classes, when they tell you to do things, you're like, the body doesn't do that. And
Yes,
what you realize, it's a very tiny movement, and you can do some of it, right? It's
absolutely.
these minor, very minor changes can make an enormous impact on just you and how you fit in this world and in relation to others.
And if I can add to that, it's really
Mm-hmm.
interesting because as you were talking about modern living, so much of it is based on the sensations that we're aware of, right? The things that we can see, that we can feel, that we can taste, we can touch, we can hear. But there are many body systems and just ways of knowing or checking in with ourself. And you mentioned one with knowing where we are in space, right? This proprioception. We can sense our hunger. We can sense whether we are balanced, or we can sense interoception, which is what's going on the inside. And so connected to this practice or this wide array of practices that exist in mindfulness, we're able to tune into some of those subtle sensations.
The initial benefits, like that comes very quickly,
Mm.
even when you're starting the practice. Like, if you are open to it and you allow yourself to become attuned to things and I think that will lead us to our next question, that can sometimes be uncomfortable. Um, it provides a greater sense of being able to be present. So, the next question that we're moving into. So, in our modern world, and I'll just use the legal profession as an example, it's incredibly demanding and it causes a great deal of stress. And that stress, um, w- once unmanaged, becomes anxiety and or panic. Um, how can mindfulness help ease that stress and anxiety?
I don't know about everyone else, but for me, it feels like there's almost this fast forward button on time, right? Things are
Mm-hmm.
moving really, really fast. The amount of information is coming from many different angles, and so this accumulation of stress is one that is a shared experience. And when you add on top of that some of the high stress professions and work environments, work conditions, then it becomes a necessity to have something to mitigate some of that stress. And so, there's a phrase or this idea that two people can experience the same exact thing and have very different responses to it. So one way that mindfulness helps to really manage stress is it creates a sense of spaciousness, right? So in between an event that happens, with continued practice, we start to increase our capacity to not only hold those experiences, but more than anything, that we are less likely to attach story or meaning to it. Right, we're able to. So one of the things that I mentioned in the very beginning was how mindfulness encourages a sense of non-attachment. So if a situation happens or a circumstance I find myself in, I am able to, and when I say I'm using that as a one who practices mindfulness, one who develops a personal practice, being able to separate from the event and choose how to respond as a result. And so, oftentimes, the events that happen in our lives are causing the chemistry of stress. So in
Mm-hmm.
our modern world, right, our biology may not have quite caught up with the the machinery that we have, right? In the past, the threat looked very different. These threats that we were under were very real, right? You would walk outside and there might be a tiger or a saber tooth beast that was, threatening our survival. Now, these threats look like the person who cut us off in traffic. It looks
Mm-hmm.
like the person who didn't hold the elevator for us, or it
Mm-hmm.
looks like the person who stepped on my toe on the train, right? And so the body is relaying this information as simply threat, which in turn creates the chemistry of stress. And over time, this chronic stress is what gives rise to many of the ill types of health outcomes that we see.
So I think what I'd like to do is bring up a situation and see what your thoughts are. So you were talking about mindfulness and being present. What happens if you're in a situation where you want to escape? You don't want to be present. So, for example, if I am in the midst of a panic attack, or I've had a close relative recently who had surgery and is, in a hospital bed and is experiencing very terrible pain. Um, in neither of those situations do either one of us want to be present. But how does mindfulness still help us, even if in the moment we are enduring something that seems overwhelming, either emotionally, physically, or both?
Yeah, that's a great question, and two things come to mind for me: this awareness, right? This awareness that there's a situation that is unwanted, and then the other piece that I think is sometimes rather challenging is the acceptance.
Mm.
Mindfulness encourages us to not only be aware but to accept, right? Because this idea that we can push away or move a particular situation that is happening, I think creates the condition for a mental state that is more agitated. And so with the acceptance, I think this becomes a larger part of the practice for some, right? Where the practice is in accepting circumstances that may not be pleasant or may not be necessarily wanted, but that non-attachment, continuing to come back to it, right? We often use an analogy in mindfulness practice, and I'll use a specific tool of mindfulness, which is a seated meditation, right? So oftentimes in seated meditation, we encourage to think about the states of mind almost like the sky. And in the sky, there are, passing clouds, there are storms that may pass, but at the very base of that is simply sky. And so once we start to practice with that type of expansiveness, this type of spaciousness that exists, then we can also do that with circumstances in our life, right? We might look back and realize, what, there were other times where I encountered a situation that was unpleasant and it passed. There were, situations where, I was in a conflict or I lost a particular thing that I cared about and it passed. And so I think those two things are critical parts of the practice. And oftentimes, in my own personal experience of working with a number of people, the awareness piece almost is easy. It's the acceptance that becomes a really, really
Mhm.
critical part of the practice.
I would agree with that. Not that I've done a lot of mindfulness, I've done some, but it's almost always the acceptance that's difficult. That it seems to take a great deal of time, because you can be aware and be honest about a situation that's happening. But I think the willingness to accept that situation in its fullness without judgment can be part of the stumbling block for many. So, for example, I do have really bad anxiety, and when stress builds up, I have anxiety attacks. So, not panic attacks that are very immediate and can go away. And they're quite terrible panic attacks. They can go away in a couple of days. My anxiety is kind of more slow moving, and it can last weeks. And it's really terrible. And I think one of the recent things I was able to acknowledge with mindfulness was there are things that happen, right? In life, your job, home, commuting, just existing. And I think part of the issue for me was the perception that these things were happening to me, like to me specifically, like just by being these things were and not realizing that even if I weren't in the picture, these things would happen. So the person who ran through the crosswalk and almost ran me over, they weren't like aiming for me, even though in the moment it may have felt that way. They were going to run through that light in the crosswalk regardless of whether I was there, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that kind of shift in like this was going to happen, it's not happening to me, right? It was going to happen, really freed some of that up. It went from being something that was incredibly personal, that was causing me significant anxiety, like why are these things happening to me, with the realization like whether I was in that crosswalk, that person was going to run the light. Whether I made it to the train station on time, the train was going to be late, right? Acknowledging that there are, which is hard for someone who has control issues, that there are things out of your control.
Yeah. Yeah. And
So,
thank you for sharing that, because what it brings to mind for me is, you know, some of the ways in which we might even over identify with things, right? So one of the things about mindfulness, a practice, right, is that noticing the difference between, I'll say, I have, a particular thing or an experience versus that experience or that thing being present, right? And so when we start to create that type of space in between it, we can recognize where, again, there's kind of this, it's not me that, has, I might be experiencing symptoms of something, or, and again, this is not a one size fits all, right? This is depending on where we are in our own personal journey and our own personal practice, because again, there's that piece of acceptance, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'll use an example of, when I was a classroom teacher, and I remember times where, the principal or the administrator would come into the room, and instantly there were like the sweaty palms, and I'm like, oh my gosh, why are they here? What are they doing here? And being able to create that space that suggested a person is in the room. And as I was able to tell myself that story, then I noticed a sense of ease that could come over me,
Mm-hmm.
right? And because oftentimes, even, and this goes right in line with sort of that embodied piece, we don't necessarily realize how certain environments are impacting us. Um, so that made me think about how powerful it is to be able to create that spaciousness, to be able to respond to a situation versus necessarily reacting out of impulse.
Mm-hmm. And I think the key part that you also mentioned was the idea of acknowledging and letting go, not creating like an ownership of something or an attachment. I think that was the term you used. But I
Yeah.
think that that's kind of how anxiety and stress can work together to form that attachment to something that's not necessarily healthy.
Absolutely. And I had a teacher once who even added a reframe on those types of situations. I think one of the examples they give is like, someone cuts you off in traffic and they kind of speed by you. And, it part of the practice is being able to like take that situation for what it is, and even potentially reframe it and say, I really hope that person makes it to the bathroom, because
Mm-hmm.
again, we don't always understand what someone else is going through, and so I can then, once I've accepted, once I, of course, I'm okay,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm able to say, what, wow, I hope they really get to the bathroom in time, because they were definitely in a rush, and it's less just weight that I have to carry for the rest of the day.
Yes. Well, it's a very different perspective. Someone rushed by because they have an emergency versus someone cut me
Hmm.
off,
Yeah.
right? One is going to ruin your day and the other won't.
Right. And we have the opportunity there to train things like compassion, to train
Mm-hmm.
kindness, to consider, well, what if I had to go to the bathroom really bad, or I was rushing to
Mm-hmm.
get somewhere, or what, I might even understand a time where I was in a rush to get somewhere, and perhaps I might have cut someone off then.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I think about is how powerful it is. I think about almost like a dentist, right? So we go to the dentist and we have regular hygiene to ideally prevent really big instances of like a cavity or needing a root canal or something like that. And so one aspect of our mental hygiene, and when I say mental, I'm not sort of limiting it to just the brain, not just our
Mm-hmm.
head, but one aspect of our mental hygiene is to have a regular check up with ourselves. How often is it that we're waking up in the morning even and saying, what, how are you today?
Mm-hmm.
Good morning.
Mm-hmm.
These types of things, again, while they seem subtle, while they seem small, they really add up, and they really help to mitigate the stress of our day-to-day fast-paced life.
Building on that, I do have a question for you, and I think we kind of touched on it when we were initially talking. So, one of the weird things that I experience, and I think others experience this too, is even though I am thoroughly exhausted at the end of the day, and I just can't wait to go to sleep, the moment my head touches the pillow, I start ruminating, right? And it's not necessarily about stuff that happened today. It's like that time in fifth grade that I got embarrassed by something, which I can't go back to fifth grade. That is so many years ago. um, what is going on? Like, why is my brain doing this? And what can I do to stop this ruminating?
Yeah, that's a really really good question, and I don't know the exact numbers, the statistics on incidents of insomnia, but just in my experience of working with people, there's so
Mhm.
many people who really struggle in the evening with sort of that wind down. An analogy that I like to think about is, we were mentioning how life is fast paced, how there are so many different things from so many different angles. And so, usually, what that does is it's keeping our brain, right? The brain is constantly translating information, even that which we don't fully understand, right? And so, a big piece of that is that, if we imagine sort of this engine, this car running down the expressway at full speed. It's almost what's happening a lot of times with our internal systems. And instead of going down the exit ramp and, almost coming to a deceleration and a gentle stop, it's almost as if we run down that exit ramp and just shut the engine off. Right. And so there's almost this overload of sensation of, again, a signal of danger, of threat,
Mhm.
right? And so it's really difficult for the system, our system, to come to a shutdown in that way. And so one of the things that I like to think about, especially in the evening, is how can we begin to down regulate. So one of the I think one of the most accessible things to consider is exposure to light, right?
Mhm.
So when we talk about circadian rhythm, our biology is programmed for natural cycles of daylight and night. Now there's many instances where the artificial light, the fluorescent lights, the all the lights, the TV, everything is constantly sending the signal, obviously not to our conscious mind, but to the
Mhm.
subconscious, that it is time to be alert, it is time to be awake. And, in turn, it makes me think about perhaps even metabolism, how we're eating, right? If we are accustomed to eating meals during late hours right before bed, then again, we're sending the signal not that it's time to rest, not that it's time to digest, but that it's time to use that as fuel to be able to perform, to do something. And so I think one of the really key elements here is to again take the time to and create the space to slow down, become attuned to what these sensations are saying. The other thing is, for some, like I mentioned, for myself, I had a writing practice very early. I'd be curious to know what some of the, like, there was a point in time where one client I worked with, she would often ruminate about what's going to happen the next day, or
Mhm.
even more common was all of the things that she didn't do for that day that she had planned to do. And so one of the things that we worked on over time was, what, honor that, maybe take pen to paper and make a gentle list, get some of those things out, and actually honor what your body's calling for in that moment. I mean, there are, again, tons and tons of practices, and I think this is really the benefit of working with individuals, being in community with practices like
Mhm.
mindfulness, because again, being able to tune into the sensations that are present once those thoughts start to arise, is a really really valuable and worthwhile practice to develop.
Those are wonderful, wonderful recommendations. I really like the idea of like trying to wind down, possibly earlier than you need to go to bed, so your systems kind of, I guess, identify biologically with what is supposed to be happening. Like, you should be slowing down and getting ready to sleep, and also the idea of honoring what your concerns are. So even in a written practice, or maybe even doing a video blog over time, so that you can revisit and see what some of those issues were that were causing you to ruminate. And hopefully with mindfulness practice, it becomes less frequent, the need for
Absolutely.
the rumination. Um, so I have a follow-up question for you. So as someone who struggles with anxiety at times, when it's at its worst and I'm really stressed out, one of the things, and I'm not usually the squeaky wheel. If I say to you, I'm anxious and stressed out, that pretty much means like I'm at a 10 if I'm admitting it verbally. And one of the things I find like very unhelpful is when people say to me, just take a breath, count to 10, go for a walk. That doesn't help me. Like, I just want to say, I would rather you right now. Like, that would make me feel better. Right? Just breathe. Like, I am breathing. Do you not see my nostrils flaring? I'm like almost to the point of hyperventilating. I am breathing. Is it because I'm in such like a ramped up state? What would I need to do, or what would anyone need to do who finds themselves at that like really heightened state, to get themselves, their systems down to where like going for a walk would be helpful, just breathing would be helpful? Do you have tips that you can offer that would like help someone come down from that level?
You mentioned a couple different tools or modalities. One of the first things is, again, reflecting back on that acceptance. This experience is present, it's here, right? And so when we think about, don't think about a pink elephant. I don't want to think about a pink elephant. And the only thing that comes to mind is the pink elephant, right? And
Yeah.
so when we really engage in different modalities, different practices, then we start to find what works for me, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
my practice. One of the things that really resonate for me in the content, even that I put out, is it's all practice, because at any given point, we can start to engage with different practices, different modalities, again, because it's about who we're being. When these unpleasant experiences, as severe or as not severe as they are, when they're present, who am I being? Right? When I'm in this space of waiting for this moment to pass, am I being impatient? If I'm being impatient, then it's probably going to, exacerbate, get a little more
Mm-hmm.
sticky. If, part of my practice is being kind to myself, then acknowledging this is present. And as I continue to practice, tuning in with sensations of breath. If I, again, continue to realize that this doesn't work for me, then I might need to do something that's a little bit more vigorous. Maybe I need to
Mm-hmm.
punch a pillow. Maybe I do
Mm-hmm.
need to, have some way to be able to scream into a pillow. Or when I
Mm-hmm.
go for my walk, you know what? I need to find a secluded place where I can scream, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so really it's about developing the practice, developing the modality that really works on a personal level. And this is really the beauty of really playing with it, right? Starting to see the lightheartedness, the not taking everything so seriously, because it's really in kind of the developing the day-to-day, the micro practices. This is what I really like to develop, these micro practices where we can really engage with it such that, you know what, by the time it gets to a certain level, I know to disengage from an environment. I know to stand
Mm-hmm.
up and roll my shoulders back at my desk. I know to
Mm-hmm.
not respond to that email right in that moment, or even, bringing awareness to the tension that we hold in our hands. If I'm holding all of this tension in my hands, and based on, some experience or interaction that I've had with a coworker, I can take a pause and I can just bring awareness to my hands, kind of work them out a little bit. And again, I know what I'm doing, but my neighbor may not necessarily know. When I'm sitting on the train and I kind of change my posture a little bit, I know that I'm looking to generate more energy, more spaciousness, uh, more space for myself. And so I think that's one of the
Mm-hmm.
really, really powerful things about developing a personal practice, when we are experiencing situations that are severe, like you mentioned.
So Tim, you've offered us so many great ideas and great tips if someone wanted to start a meditation practice and wanted coaching? Because I think one, like yoga, it's one of those things that you need coaching when you first start. How can someone get in touch with you?
So I share content daily on Instagram. And the content that I share on Instagram is really geared towards everyday practices of mindfulness. I also share insights there. I share content on LinkedIn as well. And this
Mm-hmm.
is geared more towards kind of the corporate space and how is it that we're able to manage work stress.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also offering in the month of September a beginner's meditation course. For this course is specifically for men, so that we can have a space to sit down and be able to engage, again, not just with a seated meditation practice, but also various aspects of mindfulness and especially mobility, so that we can feel better in these bodies and move our joints better. So those are three things that I have right on the horizon. I also am a content creator on the Insight Timer app, which is a meditation app for individuals who want to be able to develop a practice with the guidance of um, an app.
At the end of this video, we'll be sure to include contact information and handles where you can find Tim and his contact and how you can reach out to him. If you would like his services as a coach, I would really, really recommend doing so. Mindfulness is something you want to get right from the beginning. So, we've been talking about mindfulness and meditation and again, those are very loaded words. So I feel very grateful that Tim will give us a little coaching on how to meditate and be mindful. So this is just going to be a small sample of what meditation and mindfulness can do for you. And if you want more, you can follow Tim and we'll provide all of the information for his social media at the end of this video. So Tim, take it away.
Absolutely. So before we get started, I want to say thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for this conversation. I really believe that mindfulness is the way to create that space that we all are yearning for. And
Mm-hmm.
so I'm going to lead us in a short practice. And this practice is one that invites us to play with presence. And so, literally, right from where you are, you might just allow yourself to kind of move your shoulders a little bit, or if there's anything that feels like you need to move, you can wiggle side to side, let the head kind of sway a little bit. And so, right from where you are, I'm going to invite you just to allow your eyes to scan around your space, just noticing the space that you are sitting in this moment. You might begin to notice different textures, different colors, shapes, light, just simply noticing what's present. And as your eyes are wandering, it's perfectly normal that you begin to have thoughts that pop up in your head, and that's okay. Just allow those thoughts to be present. If you find that your eyes are attracted to a certain color or a certain shape, you can allow them to rest there. Just simply noticing the space that you're in. And you might take a moment just to allow your eyelids to become a little heavy, finding a gaze soft, just feeling the sensation of the eyelids heavy. You might start to notice the sensation of breathing, feeling the flow of the inhale and the flow of the exhale. And if it feels right, you might bring the eyes to close completely. And as you engage with the sensation of breath, you might use a simple reminder: breath moving in on the inhale and breath moving out on the exhale. Maybe feeling the physical sensation of breath as it enters the nostrils and breath as it leaves the nostrils. You might feel the expansion of the belly. And noticing the sensation of the body sitting. And in a moment, we will begin to bring this practice to a close in a gentle, kind way, in the same way in which we entered. I invite you to bring gentle awareness to the thumb and the pointer finger, maybe rubbing them together. Bringing the thumb and the middle finger together, gently rubbing them together. Shifting to the thumb and the ring finger, gently rubbing them together. And finally, the thumb with the pinky. And as you feel ready, you might gently float the eyelids open, again, beginning to take light. And you might allow the movements of the body to become a little more pronounced, again, moving the shoulders. And as we finish up, I'll leave you with a compound practice on top of that. Peace begins with me.
Oh, Tim, thank you so much for that. It was wonderful reconnecting with you and having you on the show. Again, at the end of this video, what we'll do is provide our viewers and listeners with your contact information. Do you have any closing thoughts or ideas you'd like to share?
Again, so much gratitude for this space, to have this conversation, to really demystify practices of mindfulness. I truly believe that as we move forward, it's critical that we combine or find the path from our head to our heart so that we can do the most good with our hands. So thank you so much for this opportunity.